Hi, this is Chris, and I'm going to attempt to do today something I've never done before, and that is to provide you all with a commentary to an album. I've never done this for a Yes album. I don't know if anyone's ever done it for any album. However, I'm going to attempt to do it for Fish Out of Water, which was my solo album, which I made in 1975. And if you can picture yourself around, I don't know, 1 a.m. in the morning, sitting between the choir stalls in St. Paul's Cathedral, mainly in darkness with a little bit of light on, which was a little spooky. But I'd spent time there singing in the choir on when St. Paul's were on holiday, mainly because of the fact that when Andrew Jackman and I were both young, we had been in the church choir along with his younger brother Gregory, and in northwest London, St Andrew's Church, Kingsbury, and we had met up with Barry Rose, who taught us all to sing as lads. Now we'll come back to this in a minute, but if you can picture that scene. Prior to being there, we had Andrew Jackman and Bill Bruford, drummer of course with Yes and various other bands, King Crimson, etc., and Earthworks. We had recorded the backing track with keyboards and drums and bass in the basement of my house in Virginia Water in Surrey, and we'd done a pretty good job of actually putting together some pretty organized tracks, and prior to that, even Andrew and myself had I'd composed the music, and then he sat down and helped me put it all together, as he was going to be the arranger on the record, and we discussed that we wanted to make basically a pretty orchestral, big sounding album, and Andrew was very keen on doing that. He'd spent a lot of his life training in orchestration, and so it was an exciting project for both of us. So we spent a couple of months doing the writing, and then we moved into the studio. As I said, Bill Bruford showed up. Gregory Jackman, Andrew's younger brother, was the engineer on the album, and Nigel Luby, who was my assistant on the road as well, was assisting in the studio. Yep. So anyway, we'd finished recording the backtracks, and one of the first things we wanted to do between Andrew and myself, we had persuaded Barry Rose that he wanted to play on a rock record, even though he'd never done anything like that in his life before, and of course we wanted him to play it on the organ in St Paul's Cathedral, and so he was up for it. So we went in very late one night, and I remember that listening to the foldback from one tape recorder, and Andrew was conducting Barry playing, and Andrew, I remember, was anticipating the music by 2 or maybe even 3 beats while he was conducting Barry, who wasn't wearing headphones. Andrew was, and Andrew had to think about 3 beats ahead, because by the time the organ spoke and it was recorded, it came back much later than the actual physical act of pressing the keys. And so we took it back to the studio, and it turned out very well, and with a bit of fiddling around, we got everything to go in sync. And so here we are with the opening chords to Hold Out Your Hand. Of course, the Rickenbacker bass sound that I'm using on this track, I developed and used on Ritual on side 4 of Topographic Oceans, kind of a Jack Brucey fuzzy sound, enter Bill Bruford. Excellent drumming on this track. All of them actually.
You can feel it.
song I originally written from the keyboards, so the chords were developed first. I developed the bass line from the chord structure, and then later the vocals and the melody. I tend to always work like that on solo things. I tend to get the music first and the vocal and lyric afterwards.
All the treasures of the universe are lying at your feet.
Enter the orchestra for the first time, I believe. And Andrew Jackman, as I mentioned previously, had done all the arrangements, and I remember we were recording the whole album, all 5 songs, with the orchestra, and I was amazed as I sat there in the studio and they played everything that was required of them within a 3-hour period, which I thought was remarkable that they could get all the notes right that quickly. But that's the London Symphony Orchestra, and I guess that's what they do every day. But I think even some of them enjoyed it. Back in those days, symphony players weren't all that fond of rock and roll, but some of them did. And the bass solo. Leading into the organ solo by Barry Rose from St. Paul's. As I mentioned previously, getting some of the organ in sync with the track took quite a lot of fiddling around back in the studio to get the timing right. This was in the days before computers and digital recording, so it was quite a job. Some of the echo effects you're hearing on the vocals, back in those days, digital effects had just really been developed, and some of the, I think I had one of the very first Eventide digital delay units and an Eventide phaser. I think those are the only 2 rack-mounted effects we had in those days, but we overused them real well. And Into You By My Side. This is a ballady 3/4 song, which is unusual, sort of a feel for something that I would write, but it came about, and I was particularly attracted to trying to get that Graham Nash kind of vocal melody and sound. I was a big fan of Crosby, Stills and Nash, and so I tried to work on that with this song. That last little drum break you heard, that was me. That was my one contribution to the drumming on the whole album. Phil hadn't played a drum fill, so I added it in later. So I was like looking at some of the people that I'd grown up with as influences and borrowing a bit from here and a bit from there. And now we have the great flute solo from Jimmy Hastings.
And you by my side.
Jimmy Hastings was quite a character. He'd been a session musician for many years and had a lot of anecdotes, and I remember one night when we were overdubbing this solo back in the studio, he told me that he could always beat the breathalyzer DUI test because he had that flute player's capability of breathing in through his nose and breathing out straight away, so that none of the oxygen got tainted by the alcoholic contaminants in his body, and so he was a man who was always comfortable driving home with the future in. Great solo, though, great player. I remember when we were mixing this, and we had all the faders when we had all the faders up, I realised that we had a bit of a kitchen sink mix here, because we had harmonies, harmonies on the lead vocal, background vocals, orchestra, St. Paul's Cathedral organ, and it was quite a mixing feat, but Gregory Chapman steered us very well through the mix, and ended up sounding great. In fact, when I listened to the original vinyl copy of the album, it still sounds great to this day. And here's the big orchestral outro doubling the bass melody, and very successful. I've never done this before, so I don't know if I look stupid on doing it on camera, but we were going to do it all just audio to start with, and then Gerard, my friend, suggested we just film it, so I'm trying to look interesting while I talk and relax. Segue into Silently Falling. Some very nice woodwind. Slightly Stravinsky influenced. On this track, we're joined by Mel Collins on, I think, a tenor saxophone on this track. He's not playing a solo part, but he's playing textural parts in the middle section. Of course, also Patrick Moraz makes an appearance playing Hammond. And also, quite interestingly, on the last section, I think, to my knowledge anyway, he comes up with the first idea of playing a bass part on a mini-moog, which this is prior to the Bee Gees or any of those dance records, where that became a heavily featured thing over the next few years. And I can honestly say it's the first time I'd ever heard a bass played on a Moog synth, so Patrick was definitely very creative, had some very original ideas. The old Rickenbacker fuzz bass there. More Beach Boys.
Don't believe in miracles, but I do believe in love. Don't advise you to stick to rules, but there ain't no need.
As you may have noticed by now, as I mentioned in the first place, most of the all the songs were piano based in the writing, and there's almost a complete lack of guitar on the whole album. There's a little bit of guitar here, playing a little Rickenbacker 12-string, playing a little textural high part there, and there's also some more guitar on the end of this track, the last section, Silently Falling, where I tried to do my best to imitate Neil Young. Quite successfully. Leading into Patrick Moraz's Hammond solo, which I have to say is one of the best Hammond solos I've heard to this day. And although we did do it in sections to an extent, or take the best from various solos, you know, it wasn't many takes, and there's some brilliant Hammond playing here. Bill Bruford in his jazz style, place where he's very at home. I'll let you listen to Patrick for a minute. Hear the saxophones coming in now in the background. And Bill's really getting into his stride there and delivering a lot of energy, and solo ends up as a little duel between the Hammond and a little bass solo on the end. Kind of very Hendrix influence. Oh yeah, and that repeat noise you're hearing that sounds a bit like a submarine, that was a happy accident that happened in the studio. That in those days you used a reel or tape for echo repeats, and if you suddenly stopped it, you would get this continuously cascading kind of repeat. To the best of my memory, that's what it was. All I know also is that it took forever to get it in time, and but when we did, it was good. and also some very nice phasing on the bass here.
Stills the sea, restores the crown, breathing life to life that could not breathe. Hopefully,
I always liked this section because it had that Beatley quality about it. And once again, Bill Bruford drumming really good. Speeds up a little bit, but in those days we used to just play like that. And here's the aforementioned Patrick Moraz bass synth part, playing along with Bill Bruford's bass drum, and first time I'd ever heard that, while I decorated with little bass parts and, as I said, my Neil Young type guitar, attacky bits. Like that. And yeah, this is the only significant part of the album with any guitar, which is all the Rickenbacker 12 string. And once again, my Neil Young influence. A nice mixed blend of, you know, drums and violins playing away, and the other electric instruments. And once again, Patrick Moraz decorating with the bass synth. And if you, yeah, there was a reverse gong right there, which was, I believe, a cymbal or a gong. I don't think he had a gong. It was probably a slowed down cymbal that was once again put on the echo loop. You may have heard me sing E-O-Ho there, possibly before Sting ever did, but I'm not going to brag about that. Hi, we're back. Just before we start side two, let me explain a little bit about what was going on that summer of spring and summer of '75. Yes was very, very busy at that time with touring commitments. And I remember, yeah, this whole year was busy for myself and the rest of the guys, to the extent where I remember working on this the music for this album, and then going away for 3 weeks and doing a tour somewhere or other, possibly the States. I can't remember exactly right now, and then coming back, and I do another 3 weeks in the studio working on Fish Out of Water, then dropping it again, leaving town, going off on another tour, and then coming back. And so yeah, definitely I guess I was getting into the area of finding out how much stamina was required to be in the modern group, and also make a solo album at the same time. Of course, I wasn't the only one doing that. Steve, John, and Alan, and Patrick Moraz were also doing the same thing at the time, and so it was quite a year for juggling events. So I'd the studio where this was recorded, as I mentioned earlier, was in my house, and I built it when I moved there at the end of '72, and it had taken a few years to come together. And in '74, Yes recorded Relaya in the studio, and I didn't have any equipment then. I just finished the shell of the studio and the control room, and had done the decoration and the carpeting, etc. But it was, we had a meeting, and that's where in '74, Yes recorded Relaya with Eddie Offord's on the road equipment, his mixing board and his MCI 24-track tape machine that he'd had specially converted to go on the road and cut into, and sometimes caused some problems. Didn't always work, but Relaya was quite a fascinating album to do, and of course I was very excited that the band were using my studio, and everyone seemed to be comfortable there. It was, of course, the home of the famous incident where we went home one day after recording Gates of Delirium, or quite a big chunk of it, and Eddie had gotten the tapes mixed up, and the one that we were supposed to keep he thought was the one we were throwing away, so he slashed through the whole reel and put it in the trash. And the next morning when we all got back to the studio, we said, no, it wasn't that version you were playing now, it was the other version. So he spent the rest of the day taking all the bits out of the trash and taping them all back together with sticky tape to reassemble the probably about 300 or 400 pieces of tape, which he did, to his credit, achieve. And I believe that's the master that ended up being on the album. So anyway, Yes finished Relaya, and we went off on tour and played that. And then I personally had been in Miami and went to the MCI factory, because at that time the exchange rate was great, and MCI had come out with a very good set of equipment. I believe John Anson also bought from them as well. And so I installed, I think it was about a 60-channel MCI desk and a 24-track machine. And then I had some Studer stereo machines, and basically it was the time when everything was quadraphonic, so the whole studio was set up to be quadraphonic. I don't think I ever ended up mixing anything in quadraphonic, but it looked good. And so with all this equipment duly installed, we set about to fish out of water. And so it was all a very exciting time for me, and which leads to side two, and the slightly more jazz influence, you could say, or offbeat first track. Side two, of course, only having two tracks, Lucky Seven being the first one, and Safe, Canon Song, was the second one, which developed into a large piece of music. The song itself only represents the first few minutes of the track, and the whole track is a good 14-15 minutes long from what I can remember, and develops into a whole orchestral canon piece. And once again, Andrew Jackman very responsible for the arrangement, and it turning out very well. However, before that, Lucky Seven. Andrew Jackman on the Fender Rhodes, and of course Lucky Seven named after the fact that it is in 7/4. This track turned out a lot better than I had hoped for, so actually I'm playing my Fender Telecaster bass, which I'd had an extra pickup put on to make it like a Fender jazz bass, and it was white, and if anyone's seen it recently, I'd like it back, because it got nicked from my studio quite a few years ago by somebody, and I did used to like that guitar a lot. However, it sounds good to this day. Of course, you're hearing the alto sax, I believe, of Mel Collins, where he also later plays a major solo towards the end. But and I will always remember when he came down to do this track, especially the solo, I think was his first take mainly, or his second take, but it was just so fluid, his playing, that he just pulled it off in a flash of brilliance. Once again, there's a nice blend of the textural violin parts in here with the saxophone. Interesting thing about this story, I think You Could Be Lucky Tonight, was actually written about, well, I had two kids at the time I did this, my two oldest girls, Carmen and Chandrika, and they were both little, and we had a nanny, and the lyric came to me one night when she was going out to the pub that maybe she'd be lucky tonight, because she wasn't very lucky in love, actually. Well, I don't know, maybe she was. I didn't keep her real concentrated. So if I may have been wrong about her whole mode of operation, but she was a very nice girl anyway. Just goes to show that everything that's written in Yes isn't cosmic. he was a great nanny.
From the trees by the silvery sands to the ice of the golden midnight lands, runs a thread of the tears that are shed with laughter on the other hand. Keeping up with the plans and the schemes, chasing dreams, hard to tell what it means, but I think we could be
Great drumming from Bill.
lucky too.
And here is that Mel Collins solo. Yeah, Bill Bruford definitely had a great talent for building excitement on a backing track, which allowed Mel, I guess, to feel the vibe and solo off of the drums. A little bit of pizzicato strings there. Very nice way of ending a track where it just seems to have things drop out and everything winds down and just ends in a kind of a chord of tranquility that starts the next song. Which was a difficult song to sing and make it sound good. I remember numerous takes of the opening vocal for it. And these were in the days before you could tune things. So you had to sing them. Trying to capture an almost an atmosphere of beauty, which is not an easy thing to do. But once again, Andrew built that in with the string arrangements.
When you say we let you down, who will mind? When your lover turns around, you will find joy.
Nice horn line there, and once again producing a very cinematic approach, very cinematic visual, I guess, to the music.
Beside you when you're walking down the street, looking
Now, a lot of this I think dodges about between various signatures. I think some of it's 11, 16. I think some of it's 13, 16. I think some of it's even 17, 16. You get a prize if you can name the bars that belong to which one. This, of course, is the main instrumental theme, this little tune, which recurs throughout the remainder of the track. And this little solo here is actually on my white Rickenbacker 8-string bass, which I do still have. Beauties of being able to have natural string basses from the orchestra was that I was able to do solos with higher notes and still maintain some low end for the overall picture. And I'm particularly happy with the way the vocals turned out in this section here. Nice harmonies. Yeah, this is 11/4 section, I believe. Or maybe not. Yeah, there's once again a phaser or a flanger. I can't remember which one. It may have been the early Eventide flanger on the bass. And this bass actually, in this section, is my blue Gibson Thunderbird bass. Once again, the 12-string Rickenbacker makes a reappearance with the counterpoint melody here. Very distinctive sound, Rickenbacker 12-string. Very clear cymbal bell sounds. Bill there. tempo change. Or in those days, kind of shifting in tempos was obviously a very natural thing. Yes, had used a lot of it, and I guess we used to regard that as a natural part of making music more than possibly people do today, but nice brass lines here. And Bill Bruford. Bill had such an extraordinary talent for understanding weird bar lengths and time signatures that there was no problem for him to solo over them, and very confidently. I always call this the Siberian section. It reminds me of the salt mine picks and axes. And has that right feeling, well, that feeling of being somewhere very cold. And slightly, a slight feel of misery, which isn't a bad thing because soon you come out into the sun. Getting a successful blending of all the themes and melodies all put together and building towards the final climax. Great chord changes, once again mainly attributable to Andrew's arranging skills and also his piano playing here coming up. Use of distances and the horns, etc. There's a very interesting effect in the string basses here where they play very odd low harmonics. So I know Andrew was particularly proud of the fact that they actually pulled it off, but somewhere around here. And leading into the final joyful celebration. No prizes for guessing that was an edit. final bass solo. Once again on the Rickenbacker with the fuzz box. That final big drum we hired in, we couldn't get it into the studio because it was this like 12-foot high thunder drum or something that we hired for the day and played one note on it. And unexpectedly at the end, just dissolving into this quiet passage which was played on my double neck Gibson that was one of those SG type Gibsons with a 6-string neck and a bass neck, and just with the 6-string pickups on. You get the reverberation effect. So I was playing the neck with the 4 strings, and you're hearing it from the other neck pickups. Well, thanks very much. Good night. Good afternoon.
Great to meet you. 31 years on from the original release of Fish Out of Water, we're looking at a sort of revamped version of it.
Yeah.
In fact, 31 years this month as we're talking, November 2006.
Yeah, that's 31 years. Yeah, it's strange enough, it's the only solo album I've ever made. Although, as you mentioned earlier at the end of the conversation, I have started work on another one. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, and it's been out there for 31 years, and it came out in '75, as you say. When it did, I think it did extremely well for the time. It did about 500,000 albums worldwide.
Yeah, it went into the charts in America and in the UK.
Yeah,
which was pretty good.
Yeah, it was, and you know, those were very pioneering sort of days, because none of us really knew what exactly what we were doing, and it hadn't been long since 24-track recording had been available. So, and I remember I just moved into my house in Surrey, and I put together a studio in the basement, and it was all part of the same project really. I bought some equipment from the MCI company in Florida, and like a mixing desk and tape recording machines, and then I bought some other Studer 1/2-inch and 1/4-inch machines as well. Mm-hmm. And put together my own studio, and at the point of it, I did a lot of the wiring and stuff myself, along together with the obviously the people who knew how it should be wired. But so the whole project became a part of finishing the studio in the house, and then making this album.
If we sort of backtrack a little bit before then, the initial idea to do the albums for me was quite interesting because no major band, and let's face it, at that time, Yes were one of the biggest rock bands in the world.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, we're going to take 9 months out or so, we're going to all make solo albums. And I thought, huh. Then everyone said, well, the band aren't going to split. This is going to be an addition. We'll do these, and then we'll come back as Yes.
Yeah.
And that was quite pioneering, really, because not many bands had done that, really.
No, not really.
Where did the idea come from to do
Well,
that?
I can say it wasn't the most popular idea in the world up at Atlantic Records, that's for sure, because I guess they smelt the idea of disintegration, and I think it reflected a little bit in their promotional effort too. They didn't go extremely. They didn't go to great lengths to promote the albums that they had on Atlantic. Of course, Rick Wakeman was on A&M.
Yeah.
And and they did go to lengths of a lot of promotion for him. And I don't know if many people know this, but I think Rick sold about 30 million albums between King Miser Henry VIII and Journey to the Centre of the Earth.
Yeah.
So he was well ahead in the lead on those stakes in terms of sales. But the rest of us were all on Atlantic, and I guess they probably didn't want to have too much solo success going, because I think they'd already had experience with Crosby, Stills and Nash and that, and they could smell when people were getting itchy and wanted to break up the corporate.
I guess what record companies see is 5 times more product for 5 times less the money coming in. So
Probably.
in some ways that's understandable, I guess.
Yeah.
But at the same time, artistically, for the artist, it's great because you've still got Yes to come back to, but you've got your own thing, which obviously sees a release for your own artistic
well,
endeavours.
for us, it was a safety valve, I think, and that's why we did it. And we were just all very interested in recording, which was I know John had recording facilities in his garage, I think, in his house, and to a lesser extent Steve Howe. I think he used more the commercial studios more, but everyone, it was that era when everyone was getting into wanting their own recording facility at home.
I can remember reading some of the reviews. It's actually probably the Melody Maker, which was, if you like, the music paper to read if you want to take serious music into account. And I can remember saying, this is the most Yes-like album. I'm thinking, well, he is actually in Yes, so it's bound to sound like a little bit like Yes. But to be fair, your bass sound is very, very distinctive. If we can talk a little bit about your style and how you came to, if you like, develop that style.
Yeah, well, the strange thing is that the style that I suppose I became best known for, because it was on our most successful single at that time, was Roundabout, with the bass riff on that was actually very mixed, real loud in the mix by Eddie Offord, and also what a lot of people didn't realise at the time is that I also played the bass part on a guitar an octave higher, mixed that in with it as well.
Right.
So people thought that was my Rickenbacker bass sound. It wasn't exactly just my Rickenbacker bass sound. It was 2 guitars.
To be fair, though, the Rickenbacker sound is very distinctive as well, and there's not many people. I mean, I know John Entwistle, for an example, played a Rickenbacker.
He did in the early days.
In the early days, as did Pete Quaife. What Paul McCartney did, and we were talking about this a little earlier, except he just sounds like Paul McCartney, whatever he plays. Yeah,
well, I think that's to an extent it applies to anyone. Mm-hmm. I have over the years had quite a collection of guitars, and people have always said to me whether I'm playing a Fender Jazz or a Gibson, it always sounds like me anyway. I just that's the way.
But that's good for you.
Yeah. But interesting enough, on the Fish Out of Order album, I was actually experimenting with different sounds from the ones that I'd become known for, which, as I said, was the twangy, trebly roundabout sound. And on Hold Out Your Hand and You By My Side, the first 2 tracks, I actually went for more of a Jack Bruce kind of sound.
Like a lead instrument,
but not so much high treble, more a more MIDI kind of distorted sound that Jack Bruce was well known for. Because of course he was one of my great influences, as was McCartney, who you mentioned, as was Entwistle, probably the most influential. And to an extent, Bill Wyman too was an influence. So it was a great time to be a young bass player because of all these different people who had great schemes of their own that you could borrow from. You know,
there's a lot of books on the market about Yes, and some are very scholarly, shall we say. It's like reading a textbook manual on something.
Yeah.
But I remember reading one who compared your bass playing rather favourably to John Coltrane and Jimi Hendrix, and I thought, God, he's got to be pleased with that.
Actually, I know the guy you're talking about. When I read that, I was like, oh, wow, okay. Good, I'll go and have a drink.
Having got that accolade under your belt, I suppose the sky's the limit, really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that comment wasn't made about me until that was in the 80s, I think, that book came out, or maybe even the 90s. But... the 70s was just a very exciting time. I mean, I was in my 20s and just, everything was very sky's the limit, and let's try and do what we can. And of course, we're getting great critical acclaim, as you mentioned, from papers like The Melody Maker and the New Musical Express. And, it was it became a bit of a joke after a while, the poll winning.
Yeah. You wouldn't put bets on it because you probably wouldn't take bets on who was going to win, would
No. I mean, there was one I think it was a Melody Maker Awards that have been given out by Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. And it was the year that they decided to have these kind of ceramic balls that had Melody Maker inside them that were on a little pole that was on a little stand.
Right.
And so, of course, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, when they realised that between the two of us, Steve Howe and myself, arrangers and bass player and guitar player and all kinds of, we had about 9 of these. Yeah. So, of course, they said, well, we'll just get this out of the way all at once. So, of course, these balls weren't attached to the cylinder. So
an armful of awards.
Yeah, an armful of awards, which of course we both dropped them all on the floor. It was, but I remember meeting, spending the rest of that day with Peter Cook was quite one of those days.
Entertaining,
it was very entertaining. He was one of my favourite comedians of all time, and so to actually be in the back of a day in a limo with him was quite a thrill for me.
If we look at the album then, Fish Out of Water, once the decision had been made to record the album, how quickly did the songwriting come together? I've always wondered if there were any tracks on that album that might have been considered for a Yes album, had Yes made an album at that point.
Well, in actual fact, one of the tracks did show up on Going for the One. One of the contenders for Fish Out of Water was Parallels,
right?
Which and Going for the One we recorded in 76, 77 over the winter, which was only like a year afterwards. So that track had also been a contender, but it didn't fit in. Well, there wasn't enough time. The album was pretty full. It was about 20 minutes aside, I think.
Yeah, it's about 42 minutes. Yeah, which is at the time for vinyl was probably pushing the limit.
That was pushing the limit a bit, yeah. But of course, I had a great engineer, Greg Jackman, who was the brother of Andrew Jackman, who did the orchestral arrangements.
He'd been
on
in the scene with you as well.
And he'd been I'd known Andrew since I was 5 years old. We were born on the same block in Kingsbury, which is next to Wembley, and. So I'd known him, and we spent all our young days together in the local church choir, and I knew all the brothers. So it was kind of interesting because Andrew, as I said, was a bit older than me, but he was in the sin, and Greg became the engineer, and Jeremy, the middle brother, became the guy who founded the King Singers. So they were a very musical family, and their dad. Bill Jackman was in the LSO as a clarinet player.
One of the things that I noticed about Fish Out of Water was the incredible orchestrations on there. They really, God bless him, he's dead now, Andrew, but his arrangements on that album are absolutely stunning.
Are stunning, and I'm just so lucky that we would caught at that moment in time, at a time when my composing was developing, and of course, Andrew was an incredible character because he, basically strove to carve a name for himself as a modern day classical composer, but he didn't mind going and do sessions for the Sex Pistols as well, and which he did. He actually did arrangements on Who Killed Bambi. I think that was what it was called.
From the film, the Rock and Roll Swindle,
So, so Andrew was an incredible person to work with, and in reality, looking back, a lot of the compositional elements on Fish Out of Water came from his head as well. And I used to say to him, Andrew, you should get a bit of a co-write credit on this. And he'd go, no, it's fine. I'll just take the arrangements credit and.
Because possibly because he was a friend of yours as well, he didn't take advantage. So there are people who possibly would have taken advantage of a situation like that.
Yeah, well, Andrew and I'd known each other since we were 5, so it was like it was natural for us to sit around, him play the piano and me play bass and work things out. And I used to do sessions for him because he used to do like those 6 songs in 3 hours for Woolworths, and he'd do the arrangements on those, and then he'd pull me in for 50 quid or something, whichever it was in the 70s or 60s.
I'm sure that'd be an interesting thing for the Yes collectors to try and track down, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Do
you remember any of the songs
well,
that
of
you
course,
did?
there wouldn't be any credit. Oh, yeah, I do remember. There were things like just cover versions of Amen Corner and stuff like that,
So you heard it here then. Chris Squire is on Top of the Pops album.
Oh, yeah. Well, Woolworths, I think it was Woolworths for sure.
Yeah.
And and Andrew used to say why he'd do that, because I was playing a bass already. Well, we were in the Sin, I suppose, at that time is when that was going on, and he liked to write the more complicated bass part because that was getting him recognised as a good pop arranger. But there was never the time for anyone to learn it properly. So I used to go around his house like the day before and learn the bass part.
Right.
So, and then, of course, that would make me look more competent when all these other guys were just like, reading, at their sessions.
You've also got a couple of the guys here. Well, one previous member of Yes with Bill Bruford on the album, and a then current member of Yes with Patrick Moraz.
Yes.
I mean, was that deliberate?
Well, it's always been. It was always weird to me and I did not for me wanting to try to keep Bill. It was always weird when he left at the end of recording Close to the Edge, because I kept looking at him like, the way Larry David, because I look at people on his show, like, Bill, let me go through this. You're an economics major, but you don't quite understand. You're making more money now you ever have, and you want to leave. Yeah. And he was just bitten by this jazz bug, and he just wanted to go and play more jazzy electric stuff with Bob Fripp, and that's what he wanted to do, because Bill was a dyed-in-the-wool jazz guy. So anyway, he left Yes, and Alan White came in, and that all worked out. And but then when I came to do Fish Out of Water, I thought, well, I've had all these years playing with Bill. It makes sense. So I asked him if he'd want to come and play on it, and he was happy to. Do
you think that's possibly why many of the critics and people reviewing albums said this is the most Yes-like album of the solo albums?
Probably, because it was the Yes rhythm section up until, as I said, Close to the Edge.
Yeah. And,
Bill and I did have... He was a very unique drummer, which made it possible for me to be more of a unique bass player, I suppose, in the way that our styles developed. He didn't play like other drummers a lot of the time. He played in a jazz way, and he used his bass drum to play accents and his snare drum as the bass drum.
Yeah.
So therefore that made or gave opportunity to various early Yes producers, and Eddie Offord when he came in as an engineer, to make the bass more like the drums.
Yeah.
And he was decorating what I was doing more. So, it was a match that probably happened by accident, but resulted in a lot of the way I played and a lot of the way I was mixed too.
you play guitar on the album, and I've noticed that a lot of bass players are sometimes frustrated guitarists. Is that the case for you?
Well, no, not really. I've never had any illusions about myself as a guitar player, but I did know I could play as well as Neil Young.
Okay. With respect to Neil Young, of course.
Well, yeah. No, although I'm sure at the time, though, I was kind of just fascinated by his style and everything he was doing, and that funky way of playing electric guitar he had. And I thought I can do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so there is a bit of that on the end of Silently Falling, and there's just a bit of picking, scale picking or chordal picking on the Safe song, but what stands out about that album in a way is that's the only guitar on it.
Yeah.
And it was just a 12-string Rickenbacker on those two tracks.
Okay.
There's no guitar anywhere else on the album, which of course is unusual for a rock and roll album.
It is. It's very unusual. Yeah. Let's look at some of the tracks. The opening two tracks run into each other. Hold Out Your Hand and You By My Side, right?
Yeah.
Was that the way you wanted to do them, or the way you wrote them, or did that just come when you were scheduling the album, maybe putting the tracks down or making see what sort of goes where, and was that a later decision of the mix maybe, or was it definitely decided that those two songs went together?
I'm pretty sure that at a certain point that when we've been working on those two songs, that we agreed to link them. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. When I was working with Andrew, because in an odd way we had to have a lot of stuff pretty much organised, because he then went and orchestrated it for the orchestra, and and we pretty much had the whole of the LSO on those sessions, thanks to Andrew's dad, who fixed the sessions and got them at a very reasonable rate, even for those days, which when things were much cheaper than obviously they are now, but he got an even better deal than that. So, but we had to have all of that work, and Andrew had worked in sessions with large groups like that, and he knew how much time we had. So a lot of the way, the amount we budgeted the amount of orchestra for the amount of time it would take to what he wrote, and I know he pushed it a lot, but he'd worked with all those guys before, and they knew that they were giving extra effort because he was Bill's son, and so there was a good feeling around those whole sessions. And I must admit, when I was at it was just a session, 3-hour session, and they did all the major pieces in that, and I was amazed when I was actually there and hearing it all happen in 3 hours like that, and it being transformed from bass drums and a guide vocal, to that,
It is, but the arrangements, again, we've said this, they are incredibly impressive by any standard. Yeah. And I suppose when you were listening to that must have thought, hey, I've got something here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, it was the first time. Yeah, but up until then, Andrew just showed me dots on what's it called? Music paper.
Manuscript paper,
exactly. And although I could read a bit as a chorister, I've never got together. You go, you see what's happening here? The flutes are doing this. I go, it looks good. So it wasn't until I actually heard them play it, that I thought, fucking hell, that's amazing.
You're able to bluff it, but when it comes, you think, yeah, okay. It takes a certain, I think, talent to be able to just look at something and then play it straight off, I think, anyway.
Oh, yeah. Well,
it's a different discipline, isn't it?
Yeah, but that whole thing of going at one stage further, being able to just write it down on manuscript and just know what it's sounding like by looking at that. I mean, obviously I've met other people since then who can do that, and Trevor Rabin being one of them. But Andrew was always the guy that I grew up thinking, God, it's amazing that he can actually do this.
Let's look at one of the other tracks, the final track on the album, Safe, which is the extended track. Yeah. And there's a whole lot of stuff going on in there. Yeah. I mean, just when you think it's coming to an end, something else comes in, and it's almost like a piece of modern classical music. There's movements in there. Yeah. And I mean, I really like that track. I know that's a favourite track of a lot of the fans as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically the premise of that is that it was a song, and we knew the song only had that much of a length to go, and then you know, it wasn't. We were thinking about, well, should we write another verse, or should I write more words, and should there be another chorus, and then once again with Andrew, we both agreed that oh no, let's just finish the song there and just make it a big instrumental outro, and then I said, well, let's try and do it, you know, like a fugue, because I always like fugues.
Yeah.
And that's the premise of how most of that end is based, in the fugue form.
There's a piece at the very end, and I was listening to it today actually, that you think, gosh, it reminded me a little bit of the end of A Day in the Life, that chord, and then there's the coda where the bass comes in again, and I thought, wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I know.
Because just when you think it's finished, there's just that little bit more to surprise you.
Yeah, well, that was just something that was an afterthought, and I think it was because, you know, I almost felt guilty about ending it on the dun dun dun, you know.
The big finish.
Yeah, it's like, and then I remember I was just interested in how that came about, because I was just fiddling around in the studio with a Gibson double neck that I had, well, I still have, which was a bass, you know, like an EB, a brown wood one, and a 6-string guitar, and I was just messing around, you know, with having the guitar pickups on but playing the bass, and that's how that came about. That's actually what that is.
But as I say, it was a nice surprise at the very end of that, because you think that big sort of chord, and then that's just fading away, and then this sort of picking comes in. I thought, oh, that's actually really nice.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, yeah, a lot of happy accidents happened on that album. You know,
of course, sometimes the best moments are purely accidents, aren't they? They happen, and you think, we'll leave that.
Yeah. Because
if you tried to do that and maybe contrived to do that, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, I mean, I've had a lot of those, especially during all the Yes recordings. You know, wow, did we mean to do that? No, let's keep it though. You know, so
a couple of things here. We've got the album here, which you signed many years ago for me on CD.
Right.
There we go, Fish Out of Water, and the cover, the photograph, was taken by Brian Lane, who was obviously the Yes manager. How did he manage to work his way into that as photographer?
Believe it or not, it's been pulled down now, but that was the Detroit Hilton.
The Detroit Hilton.
Yeah, in Detroit, in the States, and the elevators were in the middle, and either side was like this metal latticework thing, either side of these two elevator doors. And Brian Lane had just got one of those click Polaroid things.
Yeah.
That morning he'd gone and bought one. You know, like when they very first came out, and he thought for a laugh that he'd stand at the elevator and take a picture of everyone as they got up in the morning. Fortunately, I don't look like I've just got up.
It's a very unusual photograph, though.
Yeah.
And of course, on an album which is 12-inch, it's very impressive. It looks really good.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's just one of those lucky things, and the fact that even the symmetry of the way my face is lined up with the metalwork is purely luck. I mean, I just got out of the elevator, stood behind this thing, and he went like that one shot.
Another one-shot deal.
Yeah.
Where's that from? It's like sort of stained glass. Is that?
Yeah, that was a piece of stained glass that I bought from Lillian Nassau, which was a well-known antique glass dealer in New York, and it was made by Tiffany himself, and it was actually a 3D Tiffany glass thing, because he was famous for making lamps mainly, but he made a few windows like that, and the actual depth of field of the stained glass, where these fish are hanging in the middle on this thing. This actually is thicker here, the glass, than it is around here. And I just bought it really, and it was in my shower at my house. And
didn't that come as the poster with the album originally?
Yeah, it did.
As well? Yeah. Now we have another surprise here for you. A promotional single taken from the album in America, Lucky 7.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, the track stands out on the album to me as completely different from the rest of the album. It sounds very American.
Yeah.
And this particular version that we have here is an edit, and it's been edited by no less a person than Tom Dowd, who was, of course, a very famous, again, God bless him, he's dead now, but a very famous producer.
And which I've never heard.
Well, look at that, that's amazing. There you go.
I know.
You can see one side mono and one side stereo.
So
there you go.
Stereo or mono?
The mono's in red and stereo's in green.
Oh, wow.
So that's, I presume, mono for the AM stations and stereo for the FM stations.
Yeah, this was obviously a promotional tool that Atlantic Records put out there, and I guess it was to promote the album on the radio. I didn't know it existed, actually. So,
well, what I find is quite strange is that they've picked the track that is so unlike the rest of the album to promote the album. Which, can you imagine people buying that and then listening to the rest of the album? When it's not that it's a bad album, they just think, well, this is completely different from everything else on the album. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it was really. I don't know why it was. It just went in that direction because it was kind of simple, and once again, Bill Bruford's jazz influence came into it, and then I think because I felt it was heading in a slightly jazzy direction, plus the fact it is in 7/4, that's why it's called Lucky 7. I then had the idea of having Mel Collins come and play sax on it, and
some great sax on
sax
there.
is brilliant on it. I know it's. I listened to it the other day. It still stands up. It was amazing sax solo. I don't know if Mel is he still with us or not?
He's in the he was last time I spoke. It was in the 21st Century Schizoid band, which is all the ex-members of Crimson.
Oh, really?
In the band. So yeah, he's with them, or he was up until recently. Yeah. So he's still with us, thankfully.
Yeah. I know.
But the sax playing on that particular track, I had to say, is absolutely wonderful.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah,
and I remember it was pretty much a take one or take two or something. You know, it definitely we just had a run through and then did it. You know,
it's from what we've been discussing. It seems the album came together very, very quickly. Then
it did. Well, I think once again why it did is because Andrew was very organised. And he made sure that we dotted the I's and crossed the T's before we started getting people in. So it was arranged, Mel Collins is coming in to do this, that's Wednesday, 3 hours. And we got it done in a very business-like kind of way, and which kept the enthusiasm bubbling pretty high because of the fact that it was moving along quickly and everyone who was involved in it wasn't hanging around, you know, so it was kind of good. And Mel also plays baritone sax on the Silently Falling, the middle, once again, jazzy keyboard solo, and we've just gotten back to Patrick Moraz. That was your original question, I think, that Patrick was on the album. And Patrick made two very important contributions to the album. One is a fantastic Hammond organ solo that he plays in that, which that probably was a few takes, and we probably did a bit of mixing number 1 and number 5 and 3. But it ended up sounding very cohesive and really, really good. And once again, Bill's driving it in a very jazz-like way. And then the very other extremely interesting thing that Patrick brought to this album was, as far as I know, it's the first time anyone played a synth bass on something.
Really?
Yeah. As we're back in the days now when just prior to when the Bee Gees were doing their disco thing and that. And I don't know whether Patrick had heard it somewhere, maybe on a dance record or something, but when we were doing the end of Silently Falling, you know, I said, it'd be nice if I just did some noodling, twiddling around on the bass. And he goes, well, I'll just play this bass line, like the simple bass line, on my synthesizer. Well, you can do that, can you? It was like one of those. And
another happy accident.
And so that's like one of the very early original, I don't know, maybe you can find something earlier, but examples of a mini Moog playing a bass line before all the dance records came along.
When the album came out, it went into the American, I think the Billboard Top 100. I think it went in the top 30 in the UK album chart.
Yeah.
So that must have been very pleasing for you. But shortly after that, I think in early '76, I mean, the band got back together and you were going to do a tour. I think it was like spring '76.
Yeah.
And it was called the Solos Tour, which I presume was to help promote the solo albums.
Yeah.
And throw in some Yes stuff as well.
Yeah.
Problem being, the solo stuff kind of disappeared after about a week.
Yeah. Well, it should have been called the Good Intentions Tour because we, you know, in Yes rehearsals are always slightly chaotic, and because they were always associated with some new bit of Roger Dean fiberglass thing with lights and you know, it was all pioneering stuff in those days, production and everything. So all our pre-tour rehearsals were just made up with people wearing masks and soaring like fiberglass and as well as trying to play music. I don't know why we didn't do them in different buildings. But,
yes, it would have been a better idea.
But it was part of the whole camaraderie thing, I think, between the crew and us and how things were in those days. But it would result in the fact that we draw up a set and probably never actually played it until the first show in its entirety. And we all learned a bit from each other's solo albums to play, and we got round to doing the first show, and I think it ended up just about 5 hours long.
Well, we're getting into Grateful Dead territory there, aren't we?
Yeah.
Which I'm sure the Yes fans would have loved. But as an artist, you kind of flag somewhere in the middle, don't
Yeah,
you?
well, I'd seen the Grateful Dead around that period, actually at the Rainbow, up there in, what was it, Kensington Town? Where is it at?
Finsbury Park.
Finsbury Park,
Yeah.
that's right, yeah. And because our lighting guy, Michael Tate, was on loan to them, and it was between touring for us, so he went and did a stint with the Grateful Dead, and I remember I went and stood beside him on the side of the stage while they were playing. Because Michael was very responsible for a lot of the how the sunrise flashing lights and the Yes dynamic thing and that. And he was standing there for 20 minutes and he said, "Yeah, it's blue now." I said, "Yeah, it's a bit different for it." Yeah, he said, 20 minutes will be green for the 20 minutes. He said, and then I'll probably go red after that.
So they weren't big on
the hour.
They weren't big on production on the Dead.
No, they weren't big on production. But you see, but getting back to the Yes show, you see, the Yes show was generally a much more high energy thing, and so although you could do that with the Dead in that kind of a laid back Quaaludes world, you know, you couldn't really do that with Yes because it was a lot more like an active show, and I think that would then have gotten boring for people after. Well, a lot of our shows were 3.5 hours, but that was about the maximum we wanted to do.
Two of the songs from the album, though, you did manage to do on a couple of the dates. Obviously, the first two in the album, which were "Hold Out Your Hand" and "You by My Side."
Yeah.
And you said earlier we were talking that John Anderson was playing along on the bass on some of those gigs. Well, he's a big joiner inner, John, isn't he? To be fair.
Yeah.
But that must have been an interesting thing for you.
Well, it was, yeah. I mean, I seem to remember him saying, "Well, what key is it in?" And I said, "Well, it's in A flat." And I remember lending him my Paul McCartney Hofner bass.
Right.
Because I said, "Well, yeah, we could try it. You know, you could just play plonk along on some low notes while I'm playing the higher stuff." I said, "It might sound good." I never really know whether it did or not because it was fairly shambolic. You know, just all of us trying to do that. Of course, Patrick Moraz had played on. No, he hadn't played on those on the record. He mimed
in the video.
on the video, yeah.
Right.
So he knew a little bit more about it. And I remember learning something from Eliza Sunhill of John's, playing bass pedals and, I don't know, triggering vocals. It was all, it was quite involved, you know, trying to do these tracks. And I think after a while we just realised, well, we couldn't sustain a show that was going that long.
Well, I can literally tell you it's about 10 days into the tour and there's a definite cut that was like, no more solo stuff. I mean, it was very, it's not like it kind of petered out, it was just right there.
That's right.
If you look at the bootlegs, it's quite interesting.
I'd like to hear one day, see what John's bass playing was like.
I mean, that tour was very special for a number of reasons because you played at the JFK Stadium in Philadelphia. Was it 120, 130,000 people? I mean,
yeah, that was the 76
absolutely
tour, yeah.
a huge audience.
Yeah.
I mean, how difficult is it to relate to an audience like that. I mean, it's one thing playing at the Rainbow, but then when you're playing in a stadium where they're right in the bleachers at the back, I mean, that was a big show. You had Peter Frampton and Gary Wright on there as well.
That's right. Well, luckily Peter Frampton had been booked to do this stadium tour with us, and prior to his album being so big, so that obviously helped swell the amount of people, because by the time we actually did the shows, he had that huge album with Frampton Comes Alive. But I sort of remember working it out. God, I'm making $5,000 a minute on this show.
It's not bad.
No, it wasn't bad, but I don't think it ever happened again.
What would that work out per hour, hourly rate? Yeah, it's great when you can work it down to the minute. But that tour was very good. And yet after that, again, there was another change in the ranks of Yes. I mean, it seemed to be a real peak and then off in another direction. And obviously with going for the one, there was the track Parallels, which you said, which had previously been earmarked for Fish Out of Water,
Parallels, had been a contender for Fish Out of Water, but in the scheme of things, it didn't really fit. And it showed up on Going for the One, which we recorded in Montreux, and another exciting round of recording events.
Actually, if I think about that now, that song, it makes perfect sense that comes from the Fish Out of Water scene, because I can imagine that actually on the album. Now, I know you've said it.
Yeah.
It's strange that.
Yeah, it could have been, and it would have been nice to have heard it orchestrated as well. But there was never any orchestration done for it. But I don't know, maybe one day, maybe I'll do something like that.
Well, you've got the album is coming out. It's going to be a nice all singing, all dancing. This interview is going to be one side. We've got a bonus track on there, I think, and you're currently putting together ideas for another album. I mean, this is going to be your second solo album in 25 years.
Yeah, I know.
To be fair, you have been distracted by your full-time job, yes, but...
Yeah, I know. I know, whereas some of my partners have put out 130 solo albums. I won't mention exactly who that is, but a little bit of overkill, maybe.
I can remember you saying at one point that... I discussed this with you a few years ago, and you said, well, it's difficult because Andrew Jackman's not around now, and he played a big part in this album we discussed. So you're never going to make another album that sounds like this album.
Not exactly like it, but I can tell you that the guy that I was working with in this recent Sin revival on keyboards, Gerard Johnson, is very much from the same school as Andrew. And strangely enough, he's also a Catholic choir master as well. He does that as well as and he was also in the band Saint Etienne. So he's a kind of
thread there, then, isn't there?
Yeah, he's a kind of a well-rounded kind of guy, and he loves, as we do, Andrew's work. And so I've been working with him, and strangely enough, although we haven't pushed the orchestral direction or anything, the things that have come to light are leaning in that direction, but they're different. And of course, it's 35 years later, so with the technology we have now to do so much more, and of course to be able to, hear it even before I put real strings on it.
Of course, I mean, what sort of time scale are we looking at? I mean, I know currently, Yes, are on what they call a sabbatical, as they call it. I mean, we don't know how long that's going to last.
Well, I do know that we are talking now about rejoining with each other to do some work. I hopefully would like it to be next year. I've got a suspicion it may not happen until 2008 because of other people's plans.
Which might fit in nicely for the 40th anniversary of Yes, though.
Yeah, well, exactly. Which, so I would be remiss not to use this time prior to that to get the second one underway. And believe it or not, actually I've already got about 29 minutes worth of ideas, not finished ideas, but ideas.
Something to build on.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll watch this space. In the meantime, Fish Out of Water is about to be reissued into the world again. Yeah. And we're looking forward to that, and we're also obviously looking forward to more work from you with Yes, and this second solo album 35 years on. Chris, great pleasure to talk to you.
All right, thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Right. Bye-bye.